Don't worry about it.
We have the awesome Kamon making it all happen.
Having a tough day.
He deserves a big lunch after this. Maybe a glass of wine. We know.
He's a drinker, man. He needs some alcohol. Give that man some Give that man some drinking.
Take him out for some really yummy Baltimore food.
Okay, you're hot. Should we start? Okay.
You're listening to Clearing the Fog, speaking truth to expose the forces of greed with Margaret Flowers.
And Kevin Zeese.
And today we're broadcasting from Baltimore City, our hometown, where we're on the 1-year anniversary of the uprising that took place after the police murder of Freddie Gray in April of 2015. And so today we really want to talk with some people who are continuing to experience police brutality and injustice here in our city, and also talking with people that are and both sides are working on really positive things to bring changes to our city and address the injustices that we face. Did you want to say anything?
Yeah, so this is the anniversary, so there's a lot that's happened, in the last year, and a lot happened before the uprising. And so we're going to talking to guests about whether they saw this uprising coming, whether that was a symptom of much deeper problems, and what they see happening since that time. So why don't we just go right into our first guest?
That's right. So joining us is Abdul Salaam. He's a Baltimore resident and father and mental health provider who has his own corporation, The Keys Development, that works with youth. Good morning, Abdul.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So maybe if we can start out by you just kind of telling us what kind of happened to you last year. Or no, it wasn't last year. It was
2013.
2013,
Actually,
yeah.
2013.
Yeah. Tell us what happened.
Absolutely. So my incident on July 1st, 2013, I was traveling home with my son, 3 years old at the time, Amir, and regular routine day for us. And doing the community work that you described, approaching my home, I spotted some children, some neighborhood children, kind of playing in a circle, and 3 young men were coming across the street. As they walked across the street, there was a marked off police car coming in the opposite direction of me, and I said to these young men, "You guys be careful." Just doing the type of work that I do. I often intervene with young people in the community, and this was during the Trayvon Martin situation. This was during that time, right? So you can imagine, I just kind of wanted the young people to be safe and be aware of their surroundings, right? So I traveled about a block in the direction I was moving and made a right and a quick left in my alleyway. To go home, thinking everything was normal. Well, I live about halfway in the block. Once I got about 3/4 of the way to my home, I saw in my rear view flashing lights. And when I spotted the flashing lights, my first thought was to move out of the way of the office of the car, not to impede traffic, let them do whatever they need to do, go wherever they're going. Well, when they sped up the alley until they got right behind me, and when they got behind me, they announced for me to pull my vehicle over, which I did, and pulled into my driveway. I was right there at my home, had my 3-year-old son in the van. Once again, didn't want to impede traffic. My son recognized our home, be comfortable. They give me a ticket or warning, whatever they're going to do. I'll be on my way. I'm home. I go on my home. Well, that's totally opposite of what happened on this day, right? No ordinary type of stop situation. So when I pulled in my driveway, they immediately blocked my car, like they blocked it in like I was going somewhere, which I didn't want to go anywhere. And they immediately exited their vehicles, plainclothes officers. Once I spotted their plainclothes officers, and they were approaching my van aggressively. One had a gun drawn, the other 2 with their hands on their guns. I stuck my hands out the window with my wallet to announce who I was. This is my home, and try to find out what was going on and hopefully have them at ease somewhat. Announcing this is my home, my 3-year-old son's in a van. Well, they went immediately into action mode. And two officers, there were out of 3 officers, 2 were white and 1 was a black Hispanic. So the 2 officers, David Nicholas Chapman and Nathan Ulmer, came to my driver's side. One opened my door and the other immediately started to pull me out of the vehicle. Well, the one pulling me out of the vehicle was an immediate struggle with getting me out because I was seatbelted into my car seat. So they couldn't just rip me out of the vehicle. So I had to take my seatbelt off. They described this as me lunging back in the vehicle during the trial, right? So once I took the seatbelt off, they immediately ripped me, Officer Chapman immediately ripped me out of my vehicle and slammed me into the fence that was dividing my my home from my neighboring home on the left. He slammed me into that fence, then proceeded to slam me by my shirt into my yard. And finally a third bear hug slammed me into the alleyway. Once they slammed me into the alleyway, he finally stood me up, handcuffed me, immediately started to slam me again. Well, simultaneously while this is happening, the other 2 officers, Officer Ulmer and Officer Bernardez Ruiz, were going through my van violently, as though I had some type of drugs or weapons in my van. Mind you, my son was strapped into his car seat at the time at 3 years old while they're going through different packages, grocery packages, as I prepared for a cookout in New Jersey that we do every year, family reunion. So there's big groceries in the van, and my son's strapped in while they're doing this. Well, so I'm handcuffed. Officer Chapman proceeds to slam me an additional 2 to 3 times in handcuffs, and of course I can't break my fall because I don't have any hands to break my fall, so my body's breaking my fall. At this from the very beginning, from the first slam out of my vehicle, my neighbors started to respond. The first neighbor that responded was a 70-something-year-old lady who got up from her dinner table when she heard the officers pulling my vehicle over on the PA system, which is not normal in that type of neighborhood. Right. The neighbors grew from the 170-year-old lady to 20 to 25 witnesses, from 7 years old to 70 years old. The officers used intimidation tactics with my neighbors, telling them they would arrest them, they would beat the crap out of them to go back in their homes and disperse. So I'm on the ground after being slammed 4 to 5 times, handcuffed, sitting Indian style in front of my neighbors, and Officer Chapman directs me to roll over on my stomach. Before I could make any type of movements, Officer Chapman grabbed me by my feet and had me suspended in the air, handcuffed. Officer Ruiz then came to that area on the alley, we're on concrete, and I asked him, I said, "Are you going to let him do this to me?" He didn't have any type of response verbally. Officer Chapman dropped me on my head. This is all in front of witnesses. Dropped me on my head. My fall was broken by my head and my left shoulder. I was pretty much, kind of dazed and out of it and hurt at this point. And Officer Ruiz, 6'3", 250 pounds, dropped down on my head, neck area with his knee as some type of wrestling type technique move. He pinned my head on the concrete like this as Officer Chapman then shackled my feet, pulled my feet to the middle of my back where the handcuffs were, and I was sat in the hog tie position for about 5 minutes. So when they described what happened to Freddie Gray, none of this was new for me. These were tactics that were done to me, right? So at this time now, I'm just repeatedly yelling for my neighbors and pleading for them to call police, the police,
Right.
call my wife, and call my mother, who's a judge, which I announced at the time. I never announced that she was a judge in New Jersey because I kind of wanted to leave an assumption maybe she's a judge in Maryland, so that these officers would spare my life and take a little bit more precaution before they proceeded to continue to do what they were doing.
What made you afraid that they were actually going to take your life? I mean, is this tell me about how this fits into the environment of Baltimore and how communities do you have to deal with the police? I mean, are you seeing something common or is this uncommon? How does this fit in?
Well, unfortunately, a reality that a lot of black people, particularly black males, deal with is police brutality. And there's a threshold that I guess we have a spidey sense, if you will, right? As a black male, that you know when an officer has no regard for what they're doing and they won't have to answer and they'll justify anything that they are doing. So it's a spidey sense that just kind of goes off to let you know they're doing what they want to do at this time. Just take all precautions to try to live through the events.
Because you know that this happens, and this kind of a sense doesn't just come because it's a unique situation. It becomes, you know, that this is a common occurrence in Baltimore. So what did they end up charging you with, and was there a trial? What happened officially with this?
So they charged me with evading police, resisting arrest, they threatened to charge me with second-degree assault on an officer, and some traffic violations. All my charges were thrown out non-pros because after 2 times going to court, they asked for delays on both incidents because Officer Chapman and Officer Ruiz were on suspension, or administrative leave, I should say, for the death of Tyrone West and the investigation of Tyrone West.
So could you tell us when Tyrone's murder happened in relation to yours, and was the exact same officers, and what happened to them?
They've never been charged, so you call it Tyrone's killing.
Okay.
Absolutely. So Officer Nicholas David Chapman and Officer Jorge Bernardez Ruiz were both involved in my incident. Those are 2 of the 3 officers involved in my incident. And 16 days later, on the 17th July 2013, these 2 officers were the officers that stopped Tyrone West in a quote-unquote traffic violation. Same 2 officers, and wound up pulling him from his vehicle and beating him to death with other 10 or more officers. When I read that article, it reduced me to my knees and in tears, because when I read what happened, the occurrences, it was written up the same way my incident was written up, and I knew as my spidey senses went off that day that I could have been Tyrone.
That's scary.
Yeah. Or you could have been Freddie Gray. So what has happened to those officers since then? Was there any accountability? Were they held accountable? What happened?
So I have learned that at least 2 of the 3, if not all 3, have been promoted within the department. At least one of the officers involved is on now a SWAT team member. So they're doing pretty good for themselves. And actually, one of the officers responded to his depositions very late, and I believe it took him almost a month to respond. So he was working and getting paid while not responding to depositions. I would like to put that out.
Yeah. Wow. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the recent case that you had. You actually got a win out of this. I guess it's some satisfaction, but can't make up for the horrors that you've gone through. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. So we went through about a week trial. Each officer was there and responded. We had great court support from our organization, which I'm deeply in debt and appreciative of. I've had. Absolutely. Baltimore Block and the West Coalition were very supportive and sat in court with me piece by piece as well. Also, the officers are, like we stated, are all currently working. They are involved in the Tyrone West situation. So what we're hoping for through some of our work is that through these officers being found guilty of false imprisonment and excessive force, that it shows some correlation to their pattern and practice of these particular officers and the police force as a whole. But we also hope that it plays as some evidence in reopening the Tyrone West murder.
And we got some bad news on that Tyrone West murder from the state's attorney this week, who's decided that she's not going to prosecute those police. The Tyrone West family has been amazing and vigilant in trying to fight for justice in that case, and a lot of people in Baltimore really admire them for what, especially his sister Tawana, what she's been doing to stand up for justice. And that decision by Attorney Mosby really, I'm sure it's disappointing to a lot of people.
So the disappointment with State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby is there, as the disappointment has started before her with State's Attorney Greg Bernstein and several elected officials, and the system in general, the systematic dropping the ball, if you will. We've put this together ourselves from the very beginning, from those court dates that were postponed. It was us, myself, the West family, who let individuals know that these are the same officers. 2 weeks later, and Internal Affairs was called, and by myself as well as my neighbors. Had these officers been reprimanded and investigated properly, Tyrone West would be alive today. So that is blood on the city's hands. It fell on deaf ears, and for this, in the wake of this, we have the Freddie Gray situation going on and these other situations throughout the city, and we've tried to lead and advocate from a community standpoint to develop more transparency and accountability for these type of actions. But over that 2 to 3 year course, things kept transpiring, and you had the uprising as a result.
And so, what's your reaction to the uprising? Were you surprised it happened? Did you see it coming? What do you see it meaning for Baltimore that happened?
Well, I think I felt as though I saw it coming. There are certain cities, there are certain populations that you can oppress for a certain amount of time, and then there's a warrior spirit that stands up and that rebels against the oppression. And we've peacefully advocated, we've peacefully protested, we've peacefully put together politics and policy to change and create a change throughout Baltimore City. As you see individuals down at the General Legislation Assembly and making these type of proactive pushes for change. But when things start to fall on, when these type of ideas fall on deaf ears, there's only but there's a threshold that gets met by particular communities, and Baltimore is one of those warrior communities, and you see it through the uprising. But you also, that was one of the depending on your vantage point, one of the negative actions, if you will, that the nation saw. But if the nation saw what goes on a daily basis in Baltimore, and preparing for things like the General Legislation Assembly and other actions that take place, we think that we're leading the precedence for how to create change on a positive way.
Yeah, I mean, you've been working in mental health with youth for 20 years, you tell us, and there's been a lot of work going on, positive work in the city, and continuing to go on to try to address these problems. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of the legislative agenda was this year to deal with these issues, and if you know about, some of the, if gains were made in that regard? Absolutely.
So one of the staple changes that Baltimore, Maryland, and in general has trying to create is some amendments with the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, which grants law enforcement systematic excuses, if you will, immunity, and helps them create these, what I call ghost stories, and gives them time to create these ghost stories where, you have basic, obvious evidence showing that that an encounter may have been excessive force or way out of whack in general, and they have the time, the resources to create stories that don't match up and are just not just. But there has been some amendments to the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, but one of the main amendments that we still asked for is to have civilians a part of the Civilian Review Board to hold the system accountable and to have a fresh set of eyes and ears a part of investigation process.
what the state did basically was kick that back to Baltimore City. The city has to now decide to whether they want to include civilians, and if so, how. And I think the if so how is important because the police chief is saying he wants it that he appoints the civilians. And I think that would not be the spirit of what was intended. We want much more of the public involved in making sure we get civilians. I think it was Chicago is pursuing an all civilian review board, and they're going through a process of getting the people to support that. It's obviously a tough campaign, but they want all those civilian review board officials elected, which I think would be the right way to do it. And so we have a ways to go to get that to Baltimore. I just wanted to, on one point, I wanted to clarify with you on the uprising. I saw the uprising as a very positive thing. There was a moment in it that got violent, property damage violence, not people damage violence, but property damage violence, and that was brief. Most of the uprising response was really very positive. I mean, I remember being on marches going through the whole city, and they were long marches, but it was great because people were all there together, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-age. It was like such a mix of Baltimore that was out there all seeking justice. And that was really just, to me, it was a community building moment that really pulled people together. And do you see us at this stage? I always hoped out of that would come a big positive transformation in Baltimore. That we would not only civilian control of police, the community control of police, which I think the key phrase we got to be pushing for, community control of police, but also in our electoral system. I wanted to see some real changes coming, and I don't know if I've seen those yet. How do you feel about that?
Well, not just the electoral, but also kind of dealing with the root causes of the injustice that we see here in the city. But yeah.
To speak to both of those points brings me directly to our organization, Keys Development, and something that we are trying to educate and incorporate and cultivate with our young people are a young social political mind. So you have to understand the process before you can participate in the process, right? So while we are not trying to educate our young people to politics, Democrat, Republic, we're trying to educate our young people that politics are a way of collective thinking of mind, a community way of thinking, and putting ideas together to push your agenda. So that's what we're teaching our young people about the political process. It's not about just voting. It's about knowing what you're voting for, about knowing what funds, how they're appropriated, so that they can figure out the individuals that they want to put in the forefront for their community versus reactively just going to the poll and voting blue or red. So that, and I think that concept and that consciousness is what has been part of the uprising. And that's why I said, depending on what vantage point you're from, if you're in Florida and you're just getting the media vantage point of the uprising, you're thinking that, it was a bunch of rioting and what happened. But if you're in the trenches of Baltimore and you understand the culture of what came out of that month last year, April last year, if you're actually doing the work and part of the process, you understand that Baltimore is moving, and it's a great place to be able to be part of the change at this point in time.
There are, like when I talked about transformation of Baltimore, there are actually policies that are being tested and used around the country that do exactly what you talk about. Community deciding resources, as a community together and building stronger community connections. One thing, we'll have Joshua Harris on, who's the Green Party mayor, likely Green Party mayoral candidate. He's one of 3 running. And one thing he's talking about is participatory budgeting, where the community gets a certain amount of money and decides where that money gets spent. So the community decides it. That would just bring together such community spirit and understanding of each other, what our needs are, just potential that is just, far-reaching.
Well, that was the one thing I wanted to speak to the process. I mean, because it's not a matter of who gets elected. That's only one piece of what happens. But no matter who is elected, you have to have movement and people organized to set the agenda, to say that we as a community are, and you're our representative, we're telling you what we want, and we're going to pressure you to make that happen, no matter who gets into the system right now. It's a fairly corrupt kind of system.
Absolutely. And that's through one of the organizations that I'm directly working with, Community Transformation of Baltimore, and Baltimore Stand Up Be More. That is the main objective, is to bring different organizations together that have these different outlets that are participating in different platforms, and having that centralized intelligence, if you will, and that centralized agenda to uplift the different forums, to educate the community to the different forums, because not everyone's going to be great at the same thing or the same avenue, and we need those different lanes explored. So that is a vital piece of what Stand Up, Be More, and Community Transformation of Baltimore is all about.
You should admit we're part of that too.
That's true. Actually, we're excited about that effort too, and yeah, it's really about providing tools for communities to be able to. It's really about shifting power to the people. This is what it all boils down to: is that we have a lot of wisdom together. When we work together, we develop collective wisdom and solutions that aren't being talked about. That we know from our experience in our communities what we need to have to better our communities, and building power. I think there's tremendous opportunity here, and we really appreciate you taking time with us today and being so patient as we went through some technical difficulties.
Well, thank you. Absolutely, no problem.
Where can people kind of, follow what you're doing, or what would you urge them to do to get involved?
Well, most importantly, we always ask for any involvement with our youth, our children. If you like to volunteer in Baltimore, you can reach out to Keys Development. We have a lot of volunteer opportunities within the school system, also on that, and that's professional. And out of avocation, that's the occupation, the first part. And out of avocation, you can always reach out to the West Coalition, Baltimore Block, and Stand Up Be More if you would like to participate. Thank you once again. Abdul Salaam, signing out.
Great. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. Next, we're going to bring in Kelly Holsey. And Kelly's another Baltimore